Okay, this video is essentially going to be about how you can use the shape and features of a map to your advantage in a match. It should hopefully be useful for both map makers and players. So this is largely going to be about your location in the map relative to your opponent. But just as a foreword, when I say you want to occupy a certain location, I don't mean at the expense of dodging. In fact, dodging effectively is probably much more important than any advantage in positioning, so I just mean you might want to occupy a certain area to within a few meters while you keep moving as normal. Okay, so the first and most obvious thing that makes a position strong is if you can use it to partially obscure your avatar from your opponent while maintaining a full view of them. This is particularly effective against weapons with spread, such as the shotgun or to a lesser extent the SMG. But it's also going to make you a smaller target and therefore harder to hit against any weapon. Some examples of areas where you can partially obscure yourself are the low cover elements, which is a pretty obvious example. A slightly less obvious example of a situation where you can partially obscure your avatar is anywhere where you have the high ground and sufficient space to back up a bit. So you can see here I've got a good view of the other guy, but from his perspective he's going to only be able to see my top half, and I can still dodge about like normal. Something to keep in mind is that in ZGA the high grounds can cover a rather wider range of circumstances than in other games. So for example, in this case I've got the same advantages that I had from having the high ground before, so I can see the whole of my opponent and he's only going to be able to see my top half. So in this case blue is going to want to move to this side of this this vertical floor thing. Anyway, to prove I'm not bluffing, here's the view from the other perspective. You can see the other guy's gun's clearly got line of sight to me, but I can only see his top half. Anyway, I think this is probably the least important aspect of positioning, since it's hard to maintain partial cover while dodging effectively, as you've probably realised. But I still think by hanging around an area where you're going to have partial cover some of the time, that's still going to give you more of an edge than if you're just dodging in the open. Okay, my second general rule for what makes a good position is one where you get to determine when an engagement ends. So what I mean by an engagement in this case is whenever you have line of sight to an opponent and therefore they have line of sight to you. So for example, in this case, red can quickly break line of sight by just moving, out of view here. Whereas blue has got a considerably further distance to move before he can break line of sight. As for why I consider this to confer an advantage, there are a couple of reasons. Firstly, and perhaps most obviously, if you start losing, you'll want to back off and let your defence recharge due to how the defence system works. Obviously you want to have an escape route to another room rather than just hiding behind a thing. Otherwise your opponent will just want to close in and finish the job. But if you can quickly break line of sight, you'll stand a much better chance of getting away if you start losing than someone just standing in the middle of a room. So in this case, if blue started losing, in the time it takes him to break line of sight I might be able to finish the job, whereas I can very quickly get away and start escaping to another room before blue can regain line of sight. Secondly, even if you're not interested in running away, I think you still have an advantage by being able to break line of sight quickly. The reason behind this is closely related to my theory behind dodging. Every time you break line of sight and re-engage, your opponent's going to have to react to your reappearance before he can shoot you again. So there's going to be a slight delay in his aiming. Due to the third person camera, you'll be able to see them when you're obscured if you're much closer to the blocking object. That way you won't have such a delay in reacting that they will. This is particularly effective if your opponent doesn't know which side of the object you're going to emerge from, for instance, such as in this case when I can emerge from either side. Okay, so here are some examples of positions from which one player can quickly break line of sight. So once again, the player with the high ground can generally remove themselves from view quickly, whereas the guy in the middle of the floor clearly can't. And again, cover elements are an obvious example. So you can duck behind this cover and even play a kind of whack-a-mole game, emerging at different points. Lastly, certain positions are going to be more or less vulnerable to specific weapons. Some of these should be pretty obvious, but as with dodging, this is going to be something I plan to go into when I get around to doing videos on all the weapons. Okay, I think that's just about the gist of it. Something to keep in mind is obviously in an actual match you won't be able to keep an advantageous position for more than a couple of seconds due to the ease and speed of movement in ZGA, but it's very much supposed to be part of the game that you and your opponents keep repositioning on each other constantly. And if you can maintain an advantageous position for longer than your opponents over the course of the match on the whole, and if you're efficient in changing position, I believe based on theory and personal experience that you'll have a not insignificant advantage.